Okay, we are being officially recorded, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us, depending on where you are in the world. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Maria Volpe. I'm a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice at the City University of New York. This is our 283rd gathering since 9/11. We used to meet in person at John Jay, and many of you joined us, those of you who are New Yorkers, but we always had visitors each month from around the world. Since April 2020, since the pandemic, we have been meeting online. These sessions are recorded. The recordings are posted on the websites of ACR-GNY and the CUNY Dispute Resolution Center, the co-sponsors of this breakfast. Each month, these breakfasts are made possible by an amazing group of conveners that I'm so happy to be a part of, including Nikki Borofsky, Matthew Latimer, Sherston Pugh, and Chloe Choi. We are now planning our events through the next couple of months, and we've actually have speakers lined up through November. So know that we will continue these for the future. A number of you have asked us whether we would ever be going back in person. It would be really hard to have this amazing gathering each month in person because we would have to all be in New York. So we are continuing these online. We're trying to pepper in an in-person event here and there. We're thinking that perhaps one in the spring and one in the fall. We'll keep you posted. But I can tell you that the next few breakfasts will be online next month. February is Damali Peterman, who's just written Negotiating a While Black. Frank Dukes is our March speaker, who is at the University of Virginia. I think I may have confused. It's Carl Smallwood, who's our March speaker. Frank Dukes, I believe, is our April speaker. No, Zaza Johnson Al Sheikh from the UK is our April speaker. Nancy Welsh is our June speaker. Jim Malamed is our July speaker. Actually, Frank Dukes is our September speaker. And I've booked John Paul Lederach for November. So there are a few months there that I'm still working on, but you can see that we have an impressive lineup into the future. So each month, our speakers are introduced by Nikki Borofsky, and I have the pleasure of turning it over to Nikki. But before I do, I have had the good fortune of working with Baruch over the years, and it was 20 years ago that we had this amazing project on trying to better understand the challenges that were experienced by those who are in underrepresented groups in our field. And we had an amazing team at the time with Janice Tootie Jackson, Chris Kwok, Roberto Velez, and Jean Johnson, and wrote one of the early pieces on the barriers to minority participation in the field that was funded by the Hewlett Foundation, of which Baruch had been conducting an assessment at the time. They were phasing out their funding and wanted to know what the knowledge gaps were in the field. And Baruch and I were at that meeting, and we were New Yorkers and thought, well, we could try to do something in New York. So we convened focus groups and published an article at the time in the Fordham University Law Journal, Urban Law Journal. So we have a little bit of a history here, Baruch, and I am so delighted that you're able to join us this morning. And I'm going to turn it over to Nikki to more formally introduce Baruch. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria. Thank you so much. And, it's hard to introduce somebody when there's such a deep and long and impressive history um, that Professor Bush has with Professor Volpe. But I want to officially welcome everybody to the start of 2025. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome again to our 283rd Breakfast Roundtable. It's truly a testament to this community's dedication to exploring and advancing the art and practice of dispute resolution, and again to Professor Maria Volpe's tenacity in bringing us all together and welcoming so many new faces and voices to the community. So today we're going to explore what happens when mediation transcends its traditional role as just a problem-solving process. Can it foster personal transformation, moral growth, perhaps? These are the kinds of questions that really sit at the heart of today's discussion with Professor Robert A. Baruch Bush, one of the most influential voices and foundational in our field. Professor Bush is the Raines Distinguished Professor of Alternative Dispute Resolution at Hofstra University's Maurice A. Dean School of Law and co-founder and board member of the Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation. Over the past 40 years, he has dedicated his career to advancing mediation and ADR through scholarship, teaching, and practice. He is widely recognized as one of the originators of the transformative approach to mediation, as explained in his truly groundbreaking book, The Promise of Mediation, published repetitively, but first in 1994, second edition, 2005. And it was co-authored with Dr. Joseph Folger. And just in our initial conversation, there were already participants who were citing this book as still instrumental in helping them to learn more about mediation and direct their practices. It's been translated into 6 languages and remains a cornerstone in the field, advocating for a mediation approach that centers empowerment and recognition. In addition to this, theory and many contributions, there are 5 books, over 30 articles, and chapters, countless chapters on mediation and ADR. Today, we are very privileged to get a kind of sneak peek to a forthcoming article entitled Self-Determination, Needs Satisfaction, and Moral Growth in Mediation and Negligence Law, a Paradigm Shift in Underlying Worldviews, which will be published in the Harvard Negotiation Law Review this spring, 2025. That's actually, I think, the title of the earlier draft, which is available right now on the SSRN network. I will post a link to that for those of you who want to delve deeper in already. And for others, use this opportunity to question and get a little preview of something that's going to come out in the spring. This article explores how mediation can be a catalyst for moral development and personal growth by comparing it with different areas of law and offering a framework for recognizing self-determination as both a practical and ethical cornerstone of the process. Professor Bush's work has earned him very many accolades, including the ACR's William Kreider Award for Distinguished Service to the Field and the Southern California Mediation's Randolph Lowry Educator of the Year Award. As you will soon see, he's a great speaker. His ideas are profound and interesting, and we are very privileged to have him speak to us today. A quick note about today's session. There's going to be a pause mid-presentation where we're going to open the floor up formally to questions. At that point, you should feel free to raise your hand, unmute yourself, and ask them live. In the interim, please feel free to jot down your questions into the chat, either if you prefer to not lose your train of thought, that we understand, or want one of the facilitators to ask your questions to Professor Bush. We can certainly do that as well. So with all those caveats, please join me in welcoming Professor Baruch Bush as he challenges us to see mediation not just as a tool for resolving disputes, but as a profound force for personal and societal growth. Professor Bush, the floor is yours.
Wow. That's all I can say is wow. That's kind of introduction, makes you want to go back to sleep. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to stay right here with you, and I'm going to try to figure out, now how do I, okay, there you go. Now you can sort of see me with all my flaws and my sort of crazy beard, which in the cold weather, there's a lot of static electricity and it sort of goes in every direction. I can't help that. So what I'm going to do today is actually to talk about focusing on self-determination as a central element in the mediation process that distinguishes it from almost every other third-party process anyway. Some would say it also distinguishes it from the negotiation process, which is often very hard for people to find their own decision-making capacity because of the various defects that affect negotiation process. And I'm going to share with you a presentation on your screen. I hope that I can do that because both for your sake and for my sake, because it helps me to keep track of where I'm going. Professors in general and me in particular have a tendency to sort of wander off the path into storyland, and I'm going to try not to do that and to sort of keep on track here today. And this will help me do it, and it'll help you, I hope, track what I'm talking about. So the general topic is the self-determination principle, the moral dimension of that principle. And that alludes to what Nikki was saying, that there's a variety of impacts of the principle of self-determination in the mediation process. And we're going to look at that particular impact that involves the moral dimension. So let's see if I can get this thing to move. There we go. So if we're talking about the self-determination principle, let's look at mediation ethics, which I've actually done quite a bit of work on over the years, and it's still a kind of a hot topic. In most mediation ethics codes, self-determination of the parties is called and defined as, quote unquote, the fundamental principle of mediation. The ABA Family Mediator Code of Ethics says right away in the beginning, mediation is based on the principle of self-determination. What I call the tripartite Code of Ethics, AAA, ACR, and ABA Code of Ethics says right away in the first standard, mediation is based on the principle of party self-determination as to both process and outcome. I'm not going to read that whole paragraph, but you're probably all familiar with that. So, however, in practice, the so-called fundamental principle is treated very differently by different mediators. Many mediators and other kind of third parties, but we're talking about mediation, many mediators are willing to override party self-determination to a greater or lesser degree for a variety of different reasons. We'll talk about that later. Some mediators are not willing to override that principle for any reason. And that would be the kind of mediators that follow the approach that Joe Folger and I articulated in the Promise of Mediation, so-called transformative mediators. Why is there this difference in the way this so-called fundamental principle is treated in practice? Who's right in the way they treat it? Who's wrong? Is there such a thing as right and wrong? And in any event, what connection is there between this principle and what I'm going to call the quote-unquote moral dimension of the mediation process as a conflict intervention process? So that's sort of to set the stage. Now, to address this, I'm going to kind of back up into it, if that's okay with you, and probably even if it's not okay with you, by talking about the particular approach to self-determination that I advocate and that we outline in our approach to the transformative intervention process. So some background. If we take an interactional view of conflict, so we're not only talking whenever there's a conflict and we intervene in it about what is at issue, but what's going on between the parties in their interaction, in their human interaction. So there is a well-established notion of the so-called negative conflict cycle, meaning when conflict arises, whatever it's about and whatever the issues to be addressed, we become, as human beings, typically weak and self-absorbed. To define those two general terms more specifically, when conflict arises, we become unsettled, confused, fearful, disorganized, inarticulate, unsure of ourselves, and this happens on both sides of the quote-unquote table. If you imagine yourself driving along on the highway and suddenly you bump into another car, they bump into you, although you were perfectly fine with the world just before that, as soon as it happens, all of these things spring into being in your experience of yourself. And with respect to the other person, we become self-protective, defensive, hostile, suspicious. What does that guy have in his pocket when he gets out of his car to talk to me? Closed. I'm not going to say anything to him if I'm afraid of admitting to something. My lawyer told me never to say I'm sorry. Judgmental. This guy doesn't look like a really normal person. All these negative impressions and reactions to the other side also spring into being. So this is a natural, not pathological, natural reaction response to conflict for us as human beings. The circumstances of the conflict lead us to become weak within ourselves and alienated from the other side. And that dual experience of self and other, negative experience of both self and other, is a feedback loop, which is what those, I'm not the best at this internet drawing business, but if you imagine a feedback loop in the middle of those two curved lines, so that weakness feeds into our self-absorption. And the more self-absorbed and closed we are, the weaker we feel, and the weaker the other party feels as we become hostile and judgmental towards them. So this overall vicious circle, as we would call it, vicious circle of negative conflict interaction leads, as the dotted line at the left hand suggests, leads all the way down to interaction that now becomes, instead of the regular normal human interaction we might have been having before, it now becomes negative, destructive, alienating, and even demonizing. And that happens real fast. It happens all the time, and it happens real fast, and it happens no matter who you are and how sensitive you are and how put together you are. Everyone experiences, almost everyone experiences this as their normal human response to the wave of conflict overtaking them. That's the negative conflict cycle. And it leads into a pretty negative, dark, destructive place for whoever gets caught up in it. Now, now there's the rest of the story. The rest of the story is that as human beings, we are very resilient, socially as well as biologically. You know, we get colds, but we don't die from the colds. We bounce back. It takes us a few days, but we get over it. We bounce back. We come back to work. And another way of describing that, with due apologies to Forrest Gump, is that shifts happen. Shifts happen. From what to what? From weak to strong. We regain our sense of our own competence and strength. So again, to break that down, from unsettled, we become calmer. From being confused, we get clearer. From being fearful, we become more confident. Disorganized, we become more focused, unsure of ourselves, more decisive, more resourceful. And that happens also very quickly, often. I'm talking about what happens normally without the involvement of any third party, any mediator. If this didn't happen, as kind of a matter of course, we would all be dead by now, because we would be caught in that destructive cycle. And that sometimes does, unfortunately, happen. And in terms of the attitude toward the other, from self-absorption and self-centeredness, we become more responsive and open to the other party. Instead of self-protective, we begin to attend to the other party. From being defensive, we get more open. From being hostile, we grow more civil. From being suspicious, we get a little bit more trusting. From being incapable of seeing anything but our own perspective, we become able to see the other's perspective. So we move in that dimension, the dimension of the experience of self, from self-absorbed to responsive. In the dimension of the other person, the dimension of attitudes towards ourselves, we become weak to strong. If we put all of that together, it looks like this. And I have to credit my wonderful, dear colleague who passed away too early, Dorothy Della Noce. In the middle of a training program, we came up together with this diagram, which expresses what we call the conflict transformation cycle. The overall impact of which is that the interaction changes. It changes back from negative and destructive, alienating and demonizing, where it has found itself as a result of the negative conflict cycle, and it moves around the curve to become again a positive, constructive, and connecting and humanizing interaction as a result of what? As a result of the shifts the parties make from on each side towards themselves and towards each other, from weakness to strength, and from self-absorption to responsiveness to other. And we call those two shifts the empowerment shift and the recognition shift that some of you mentioned in your comments before, and that Nikki mentioned when she was describing my work. And the work of this, not just my work, it's the work that I've done with my lifelong partner, Joe Folger, and with a wonderful group of colleagues that we've assembled over the years. So the empowerment shifts are the dynamic movements that people make from the negative side to the positive side. And the result of those shifts is that as parties become strong in themselves, they get responsive to each other. There's another feedback loop. This time it's not a vicious circle, it's a virtuous circle. From weakness moving to strength, the strength opens up people to each other and they become more responsive. And the more responsive they come to each other, the more strength the other party feels, not being under attack, and the stronger I feel because I realize I'm capable of responding to something outside of myself. So these two kinds of shifts, empowerment and recognition, produce a new cycle. And that new virtuous cycle is the positive conflict cycle that leads back to positive human interaction, even if there has been no resolution of the conflict, even if it's still going on, even if you're right in the middle of it. Nevertheless, it's a different kind of conflict. And there's lots of words, other words that we can use to describe the states, negative and positive states. So we talk about people moving from a sense in themselves of being helpless, to being competent, from being hateful to being connected and compassionate towards the other person. So we move from helpless and hateful to competent and connected. That's a pretty amazing movement. And we do it all the time, all by ourselves. But sometimes we can't do that by ourselves. And when we can't, when we don't, we get stuck in this in lower left-hand corner, which is a pretty rotten place to be. What is the shift that people make? What is the change? So we talk about this as transformation of conflict. You know, we chose these words as we went along, and sometimes the words have come back to haunt us. What do you mean transformation? What are you transformative? What are you transforming? Well, when you work with parties, I'm sure you've seen this, and that's why we chose the word. They walk into the room looking small and mean, reduced in their own sense of themselves, and shooting daggers at the other party in their eyes, through their eyes. And when the mediation is over, they are transformed. They're, instead of small and mean, they're big and generous. I'm sure you have seen this happen many, many times in your work as mediators and interveners, and we've seen it too. And that's not just a change, that's a transformation from like darkness to light, from nighttime to daytime. That's a transformation. That's why we call it conflict transformation. Because you haven't necessarily resolved the conflict or reached an agreement, but you have changed the way that people are interacting with each other as human beings, even in the middle of conflict. So we call this whole cycle the conflict transformation cycle. And what's that green diagonal line going across the page? That line for us is the line of party motivation. Parties want to make this change. They don't want to stay in that lower left-hand corner. They don't want to just get an agreement or get whatever they're getting and leave their interaction as a poisonous human experience. They want to change that experience and that interaction. And that's what we say about what changes in the interaction. You can understand why they want to change it, because the interaction changes from weakness and from the parties experiencing themselves as weak and selfish to being strong and responsive, from being helpless and hateful to being competent and caring, from a sense of their own impotence and antipathy to each other to a sense of their own agency and empathy for one another, from being impulsive, reactive, to being deliberate, from negative and destructive to positive and constructive. So our claim is, based on our experience and our conversations and our research with many people, that this is what parties want and what matters to them as much as resolution, or even more for many people. Meaning what? Meaning that in conflict, as in life, what we care about as human beings is not only what we get, but how we act and interact, how we behave. The what is the substantive dimension of the conflict. The how is what I call the moral dimension of the conflict. How am I behaving as a human being? Am I behaving in a way that lives up to that title, human being? Or am I behaving in a way that is more like, quote unquote, dog eat dog? That's the moral dimension. So the diagonal going back represents the impulse that people have to change the way they're interacting with each other, and we call that a moral impulse. There's two ways to behave here. There's the low road and the high road. I want to take the high road. I'm in the middle of the low road, but I want to take the high road. I have to credit my colleague Basha Solars with this idea of our response to each other as human beings can always take the low road or the high road. We can be weak and selfish, or we can be strong and compassionate. One is the low road, the other is the high road. Almost all of us would prefer to be on the high road all the time, but it's a challenge. That's the challenge of life. It's the challenge of conflict in particular. So in meeting that challenge, the key to conflict transformation, where a third party gets involved, is to nevertheless remember party self-determination is the central moving force of this transformative cycle. And if that's the case, then my role, if I'm an intervener, is to support the parties and never supplant them, to put them in the driver's seat and let them stay there and never try to take the wheel away from them. So empowerment shifts means that I'm trying to support and never supplant each party's deliberation and decision-making. Decision-making always belongs to the parties. I support it, I don't supplant it. And in the dimension of recognition, I support but never force each party's perspective taking the perspective of the other person. I'm never going to make suggestions or coerce people or try to get people to change their views of each other. That's up to them. That's one of the decisions that they make. That's one of the things that I do, is to support the decision of how to relate to myself and the other person. That's your decision, it's not mine. When mediators support party self-determination, this increases party strength and drives conflict transformation. It drives the whole cycle. When mediators supplant party self-determination, it reinforces party weakness and stops conflict transformation in its tracks. Again, I don't want to make you dizzy, but I'm going to go back for a minute. So the empowerment arrow going from weak to strong is what starts this whole cycle moving. When I begin to regain a sense of my own competence, my own strength, my own decision-making capacity, I begin to get stronger. And as I do that, I open up to you. Very rarely do people open up to each other by themselves when they're feeling weak and self-absorbed. It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't happen. They can be pushed to open up to each other, but when you push people to do that, you have disempowered them. You've kept them or made them again weak, and therefore it's not a lasting, it's not a sustainable change. But when I support people in shifting from weak to strong, crossing that empowerment bridge, if you will, then almost automatically people stop being self-absorbed, begin becoming more open and attentive to each other. So if you imagine a kind of third arrow, make this like Zorro, right? You remember Zorro, right? Where the arrow goes across to the right and then back to the left, right? Moving to strength, and then, okay, I go back to self-absorption, but I'm a different person now, so I can open up and become responsive to you. That's the cycle. That's the cycle. And that cycle, however, only occurs if the parties start the cycle with party self-determination. That's what starts the process and drives the process. If I supplant party self-determination, then this is what happens. So the impact of supplanting is that I keep people weak. If I tell people these are the ground rules that you should use, if I tell people try not to use that language, if I tell people I think it's time we moved on to another issue, if I tell people, if I tell, every tell that I do keeps people from making that empowerment shift. And that's why, I hope you can see it on the slide, the strength, the strong word over here is faded, because it doesn't really exist. It's like ghosted. That's what I've done by my directive interventions. And if I tell people they have to think about each other differently, if I even have been asked them, well, why don't you think about maybe the way it feels to the other party? Then I've actually taken the decision about whether or not to open up to the other party. I've taken it away from that party, and I'm making the decision. I'm driving the process. When that's what we do, instead of supporting empowerment and recognition, we actually support and continue disempowerment and non-recognition. And therefore, the overall process the overall interaction doesn't change. It stays just where it sank to in the negative conflict cycle. Negative, destructive, alienating, and demonizing interaction. The bottom line, without party self-determination, without that core principle, in effect, no positive interaction develops, and the moral dimension is lost, even if agreement is reached. Agreement can be reached without respecting party self-determination. We have so many ways of getting people to do things, and so much of our training. And listen, I started out as a mediator in 1976, a long time ago. And most of what I learned in those days was how to get people to do things, right? And I learned a lot of those ways, and they worked so that I could get agreements, but that didn't change the interaction. The interaction stayed the same. And therefore, people would have agreements and they would move on, but they would move on with baggage, with the baggage, with the remembrance, with the impression of a weakness of self and a hostility to the other party, a suspicion about the other party. When the U.S. Postal Service came to us in 1999, I think, maybe 1998, they had a rich experience of getting people to agree in mediation, to agreement, managers and employees, or managers and their managers. But nevertheless, their relationship, their interaction had been poisoned, and the effect on the workplace was devastating. So what they wanted was, how do we get beyond the negative interaction? We don't just want agreements. We want a changed environment in the workplace. That means we want to change the conflict in the conflict cycle from negative to positive. So the answer, how do you do that? Is by respecting and supporting party self-determination. If you do that, that's what drives the conflict transformation process, the change from negative to destructive to positive and constructive conflict. And when you don't do that, when you support supplant party decision making, you reinforce the weakness of both parties and you stop the transformative cycle. So I think I'm going to, all right, let me say one more thing and then we'll stop. That leads us, the folks that I work with, to take what we could call a strong view of party self-determination. Meaning, what does it mean? It means a number of things. Here's a little bit of a bullet list of what that means. It means that we just listen to the parties. What do you mean just listen? We're underlying the word just. We don't have any agenda or plan of our own. We're not starting out by thinking from the get-go, what could solve this problem? What could resolve this disagreement? I don't have an agenda. I'm not thinking about any of that. I'm just listening to them. And number two, I'm following them and their agenda. I'm not leading them. I'm not controlling them. I'm following them wherever they go in this conversation. And further, specifically, what do I do when they stop talking? I reflect what they've said. I'm reflecting rather than reframing. I don't try to change what they've said. I don't try to soften what they've said. I don't ask them questions about what they've said. I don't interrogate them. Instead, I just reflect what they've said. Why? Because that helps them. When they hear their own voice reflect to them, it allows them to, in effect, have a conversation with themselves on each side. And that helps people to get clearer and stronger and more articulate. That's the first step towards changing the conflict cycle from negative to positive. I summarize what they've said, but I don't prioritize it. I don't say which issue they should talk about first, which is most important, which shouldn't really be discussed at all because it's a, quote, not mediable issue. I don't edit. I don't take things off the table if they've put them on the table. Again, that's their choice. And when I'm summarizing, I'm just giving them a kind of overall reflection of the things that they've been talking about and that they disagree about, so that they can see for themselves what it is that they need to address and decide how to address it. I check in with them. Checking in means I check in, what do you want to do next? I don't pressure them to go one way or the other at any point in the process, in the conversation. And finally, I learned to stay out of their way instead of being in on top of them all the time, which basically stifles their conflict and their decision-making. All of these kinds of mediator interventions increase party choice. That's what they all have in common. They increase party choice. And when you increase party choice, you increase party strength. You increase the agency of the parties, and that's the first step towards driving the transformative cycle from negative to positive. So to overview it, we don't say, we in the kind of mediation that I teach and advocate and practice, not as often as others, we don't say to the parties, you control the outcome, I control the process. That's the quote that you can read in almost any book about mediation, except mine. You say to the parties, you know, you have self-determination, you control the outcome, but I control the process. I'm the process expert. No, we say you control everything, outcome and process. And all I do is I support your decisions about what you want to do. Okay, I'm going to stop now. Let me just see what this is. Yes, why? Okay, good. I'm going to stop at this point. This is sort of like, again, I'm backing into discussing this idea of the quote unquote moral dimension, but let me stop now. It's probably about halfway through. Yeah, been talking for close to 25 minutes, maybe a little more, and see if you folks have questions or comments, either one, about any of this. Your turn.
So the chat has been quite active with both questions and comments as people kind of collect their thoughts. I see Jeremy has already raised his hand and unmuted himself. So let's let him take the lead. And for those of you who popped questions into the chat, either you can raise your hand next or I will ask them for you. But we've got hands popping up. Jeremy,
So thank you. It's absolutely fascinating, and this transformation that you talk about, or transition from one state of mind to the other. There is a lot of evidence on this in neuroscience now, and I don't know to what extent you've been looking at this, but these ways of thinking, these heuristics that exist, that are both emotional, social, and cognitive, are shifted. The only thing that I query and I'm trying to grapple with, and it goes in some of the questions people have been asking on unconscious biases and so on, is to what extent is everybody aware of the degree of transformation availability? And when you talk about self-determination, to what extent do people really understand the self-determination being given to them? You know, for example, if you say to people, it's your process, but we're going to bring in an expert who's going to tell everybody what they think. You know, that there's self-determination, but at the same time, there's something else being imposed. Now, I know you would not suggest that or do that, but in some mediations, people want norms, and how you bring the norms into the conversation and how you do that, there's a very subtle unconscious change in somebody coming, and you lose a bit some of that self-determination. So my question to you is, first of all, how do you integrate your model and theory with these ideas of heuristics and biases and unconscious things that get triggered? And secondly, how do you look at this in terms of ensuring everybody's really aware of what's going on, including in the mediator? Because I think we often do things, we want to give them control over not just the outcome, but the process. But even then giving them control over the process requires a full understanding of themselves and these kind of hypnotic almost states they can be in.
Okay, so I'm going to try to keep my responses short, which is hard for me and not normal for me, but that will magnify the opportunity for people to ask questions and comment. So let's do first thing first. How do I deal with heuristics, unconscious biases, and those things, cognitive biases, that stuff, right? So the answer to that is I support people hearing themselves and thinking about what they're doing, and I count on them to become aware of their biases and their and what they're experiencing. I don't think that first of all the literature on cognitive biasing says there's no way you can train people out of cognitive biasing. That's the bottom line of all that literature on cognitive biasing and all the training they've done. It doesn't change a damn thing, right? What does change is if you help people look at themselves, hear themselves, see themselves in the mirror, as it were. And when people see themselves and hear themselves, they recognize where they are themselves going off track. And they recognize, I don't want to say that. I'd rather say this. I don't really think that. I really think this. That's what supporting party self-determination means at that level, supporting party conversation. When people talk to each other in the middle of conflict, they rarely hear each other, and they almost equally rarely hear themselves. When you reflect what they say, you make their comments accessible to them. That's what you can do. And in my view, that's that's all you can do, and it's all you need to do. See, I put a great deal of faith in people to have the right stuff, to be able to become conscious of what they're doing and make conscious and good choices. So the only thing I can do, but it's the useful thing to do, is to reflect what they say and help them hear themselves and each other to talk. I don't think that I can do much of anything else. So I see a comment, I can enhance their participation by educating them about cognitive biases. Professional negotiators can't be educated effectively about cognitive biases. How do I expect people to a conflict to be able to be educated about them in the middle of the conflict? Okay, anyway, you can disagree with me. That's an answer to that question. The second question you asked was about, well, what do you do when you bring in an expert? The answer is that you don't bring in an expert. They can bring in an expert if they want to. And they can treat the expert with as much respect or disrespect as they choose to do. If they decide to put their, cast their fate to the winds, put their fate in the hands of the expert, I'm not in charge of that choice.
Sorry, just on that point of the expert, just to be clear, I wasn't suggesting you can impose this, but even when the parties say, okay, let's have an expert, there can be an invisible side to this that they're not aware of. They're not aware of the consequences that maybe they're going to use that expert competitively or may drive more competitive behavior between them. So I'm talking more about, to what extent do you go and have them in their self-determination understand the possible consequences of bringing in an expert, for example?
Well,
Because
you rely upon them, Jeremy, to catch the consequences of their own decisions. Again, I don't want to conduct a training session here. One thing you can do is to reflect their hesitation about what they've decided to do before they do it and when they do it. So what I can do in reflecting two parties as they're having a conversation about the expert, I can reflect, well, it sounds like you're not 100% sure if you want to do that. It sounds like you might have some concerns and doubts about the wisdom of doing that. I don't know whether that's true or it's not. If I reflect that to them, it helps them to, again, you want them to become conscious of what's happening. The way to help people become conscious, the least directive and most supportive way to help people do that is what we call reflection. And it actually works wonders. So again, I can't answer all the questions to your satisfaction probably, but that would be my answer. So I'm going to stop there, go on to the next. Do we have another question from the floor or from the chat?
We have a question from Gary. And I want to give him the mic, but I just want to just encapsulate a couple of the trends in another question. And I don't know if this pivots into take one of my trainings or not, but a couple of people have been commenting on, they've seen or experienced a mediator try and use a transformative approach, and the response from the participant was, "Are you just going to repeat everything that I say back to me? I need your help." Can you quickly address or pivot to say you need a full training on this, that kind of an observation and circumstance, and then we'll turn it to Gary for his question.
Okay, well, first of all, I have to say that I'm not denying what your own your lived experience, as they say. From the folks that I work with, I have never heard that they receive that kind of response. Because when they're doing the reflections they're doing, they truly are capturing what people say and helping them hear themselves talk. And most people don't mind that. I have my students go home and do this with their spouses and with their bosses. And this kind of response to human interaction is rarely received disrespectfully or rejected. It's like, yeah, that's really helpful. That really helped me get clearer. I wasn't sure what I really meant, and that helps me see. And what you said is not what I meant. But now I can understand better what I mean. So I'm not denying your own experiences. I am saying I have not had that feedback about the practice of reflection. On the contrary, the very best transformative mediators I know, and a couple of them are on this phone call or on this Zoom call, that's what they do most of the time. And the results are very, very positive. So that's all I can say. Yeah, Gary?
Thank you. Good morning. I do want to say this in terms of reframing and reflecting back, that I use it in commercial mediations, personal injury mediations, family mediations, and it's always helpful, especially in the beginning. Maybe as time goes on, you're doing it a little less, but it really does help clarify people's positions. Sometimes when you reflect back what they say, it gives them a new idea as to, first of all, it confirms that you've actually heard them. They may say, no, that's not exactly what I meant, or whatever. But that is always very useful. My question, in terms of the impact, I guess, of transformation, to what extent, and this would really be in the family context, I think, maybe in the commercial context too, now that I think of it, do you follow parties over time to see whether the transformation has had any lasting effects as compared to people, I'll put it this way, slipping back into their old modes of behavior and thinking, which I assume would be a natural tendency for all of us, and maybe especially parties to a, let's say, a divorce mediation where there could be years of habitual relation and conversation that can be changed during the mediation process for the better. But I am curious as to how long lasting, in fact, it is. And then the real basic question is, to what extent do you or others have followed people over time to try to get some idea as to the extent to which that process may have, presumably positively, affected their lives going forward?
Right. So I don't think there's any good research on this, Gary. We haven't done it. It's very hard to do. It's one of my fondest dreams to be able to do that kind of research, but research is expensive and hard to do. And although I think, over the years, what's interesting is that there has been research, some of it was done by my old colleague Craig McEwen, on the sort of recidivism rate of mediated cases as opposed to cases in court or small claims court or whatever. And all that research shows that mediation in general does better at the sustainability question. How long do agreements last? How soon do they fall apart? So if I extrapolate from that, Gary, and that's what I tend to do, since I don't have the money to do the research, if I extrapolate from that, what it tells me is that what's the big difference between the mediated agreement and the imposed judgment? It's the parties' participation and decision-making power over that outcome. People tend to, the outcomes that are attained through participation and self-determination are more sustainable. They last. I don't know about the interactional thing. What we do know about is, do people fall back into the same thing again, which comes to sort of suggest it wasn't sustainable. It didn't hold, right? Now I can go from that and say, if that's true for any kind of mediated agreement, then it seems to me it's going to be even more likely true the more that mediated agreement is the result of a process built on self-determination. The more the mediated agreement mirrors the imposed judgment, the less likely it is to be sustainable and to last over time. And unfortunately, we have plenty of, speaking of evidence, what we do have evidence of is that a lot of mediated agreements are, for all practical purposes, imposed by the mediator, by the techniques that the mediator uses to drive the parties towards a settlement, which is perceived as the ultimate goal. In the informal conversation beforehand, people were talking about the extent to which, in Europe, for example, more and more mediation cases are referred by judges that tell people you have to go to mediation, and then the case comes back if there's a settlement, right? The judges like mediators who settle cases. The judges keep batting averages, quote unquote. If this mediator has a good batting average, I'm going to use her again. If she doesn't, what is a batting average? What percentage of their cases settled? So the perverse incentive for mediators is to use various techniques to get a settlement, quote unquote, get a settlement, right? And therefore, those agreements attenuated self-determination to some degree, maybe a great degree. And then the difference between a judgment of a court and an agreement, quote unquote, achieved by a mediator is minimized, is much less. And I would suspect that therefore it's less sustainable. Or at least, if I put it the other way, if the agreement was achieved through the support of party self-determination, it's going to be far more sustainable. And if the agreement is sustainable, it's very likely true that the interactional change has also happened, A, and been sustainable, B. So I can only hypothesize these. This is what I do as a professor. I hypothesize things, right? I'm supposed to research them too, okay? The only thing we have substantial body of research on transformative mediation is the body of research produced by the U.S. Postal Service Redress Program, which is probably the most researched work program of any kind of mediation that I know of anywhere. And that research done by Lisa Bingham primarily, and her colleagues at, I think she's at Indiana University, shows that there are lasting changes, not just in agreements and workplace the outcomes, but in the workplace conflict and the sustainable change in the way that managers and employees relate to each other in the workplace. Why? Because the managers don't feel weak in themselves anymore, and the employees don't feel hostile and suspicious of the managers. So yeah, we have some research on that. Not enough, but it's a pretty substantial body.
Thanks.
Okay,
Just
so
one quick comment in
Yep.
terms of the difficulty of follow-up. I actually don't think it's all that difficult, but I don't do it, and I don't think other people do it, which is 6 months after an agreement has been worked out. Let's assume it's been there's been self-determination. It was, quote, transformative. Picking up the phone and saying, "How's it going?" And
Yeah.
I don't do it. Nobody does it, as far as I know. There's lots of mediators here. I'd be curious as to whether anybody does do it. My guess is nobody does, for all sorts of reasons. But it would certainly be
Right. No,
interesting
I agree with
to
you.
find out.
One could organize a research, you could do research in a lot of different ways. And that's what we might call qualitative research, but it would be very useful. But people you're right, don't do it.
Yeah. And with enough numbers, it's quantitative as well.
If you believe the answers the people give, that's a big question about research, right? Self-reporting is a weakness of all kinds of research, and the researchers are careful to point out, hey, that was self-reporting. We don't have an objective measure. So, okay.
I'd like to
I don't want to.
Oh, go ahead.
I know that there's not enough time for questions, but I want to move on because I want to reach the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is, so what does this have to do with the moral dimension, quote unquote? What does that even mean? And why do I think that self-determination is the key to capturing that moral dimension of mediation? Okay, so let me move on a little bit, and I'm going to try to share the screen again with you so you can, people learn in different ways. And I need this to keep myself on track, as I said. So everybody can see that now again?
We're not going to be sharing, yeah, we see it now. And although we're not going to be sharing the reprint, the recording will be posted online so people can rewatch the video and be extra prepared for the forthcoming article that will be published.
Okay, terrific. So again, this whole thing has been to suggest that I take this strong view of party self-determination. I'm as an academic, I tend to be an extremist. Okay, I tend to take very strong positions, and one reason I do so is sort of balance out the tendency to make everything the same, right? So I'm taking a strong view of self-determination, of what that means. Why? Why is that so important? Why do we think that myself and my colleagues, why do we think that's conflict transformation and the self-determination that it requires, why do we think that matters to people? Because one of my earlier slides said, you may remember, I could show it to you again, that people really want to change the quality of the interaction that they are having. And it matters to them as much as reaching an agreement. If we don't change the quality of that interaction, what does the agreement mean to us, really? What lifespan does it have? But apart from that, it's a whole different dimension. How do I feel about myself and you after the fact? Okay, we have an agreement. Bush got us to an agreement. The mediator got us to an agreement. When I was working at a community mediation center, we always used to go to the mediator's lounge afterwards and ask each other, did you get an agreement? That was always the question. And not, did the parties really seem to have changed the way they relate to each other and themselves? Well, our claim is that what matters to them is not just did they get an agreement, but did they change the interaction, the quality of the interaction? We think that matters to people. Why do we think that matters? Because we believe at a deeper or larger level, we believe that what people care about in conflict, and not just conflict, the rest of their lives, is not just what they get in an agreement or a deal, but how they act towards themselves and each other. We care about not just what we get, but how we act. The what is the subject of the conflict. The how is how we are acting and relating to each other and ourselves in the conflict. The belief that people care about not just what they get, but how they act rests on a philosophy, a worldview. I want to go back now for many of you, if you never read the first edition of The Promise of Mediation, published in 1994, go buy that book if you can still find it and read it. The two books that we published, the first and second edition of The Promise of Mediation, are different books. Even though a few of the chapters are similar, they're very different books. The second book is much more significant in figuring out how to do transformative mediation, but the first book is more significant in talking about the values underlying that approach to mediation and that approach to life in general. The first edition talks about in a whole chapter, devotes a whole chapter to quote unquote underlying values and quote unquote worldviews. What's a worldview? A worldview is a set of beliefs, basically, about human life. What's the nature of human beings? What's the nature of society? What's the nature of our social institutions for dealing with human beings in society? All of that is part of what we develop and carry as a worldview. The Promise of Mediation talks about two worldviews, and it asserts that how do you define a worldview? The most important defining characteristic of a worldview is what does it regard as the supreme value of human life? What's it all about, Alfie? What's the most important thing in life? We talked about two worldviews, the individualist worldview and the relational worldview. And I think that examples of these two worldviews can be found all over the place in literature, in the field of politics, the field of economics, the field of psychology, the field of philosophy. The two worldviews are distinguishable by the different values that they hold supreme. In the individualist worldview, the supreme value is satisfaction of human needs. This explains the title of this New Law Review article. Satisfaction of human needs. And in the relational worldview, the highest value of life is considered moral conduct, achieving conduct, enacting in our lives conduct which we can truly say is moral in human terms. What we get, that means that satisfaction, when we say that what we get matters to us, it means that we value most the satisfaction of our human needs in whatever terms, whatever kind of needs are we talking about. They can be material needs, they can be relationship needs, they can be psychological needs, they can be expressive needs like art and music, all kinds of needs in whatever terms. But the value is satisfying those needs, what we get. I'm not talking anymore about mediation per se. I'm talking about generally, what is it that we consider the most important thing to achieve in life is to meet those needs. In the relational view, what is the most important thing in life? At the end of the day, that matters to us? How did I act? How did I behave? Not what I got in my pocket, in my packet at the end of the day. How did I behave? In other words, moral conduct is valued most. The amount of time I spent on the high road as opposed to the low road in my interactions is valued most. But I'm going to get to a more specific definition of moral conduct in a minute. Now, both of those worldviews value self-determination. Think that self-determination is important. Self-determination counts in both worldviews, but it counts in a different way in each of those worldviews. So in the individualist worldview, although satisfaction matters the most, we can't generally and objectively define it for all people. Individuals define it for themselves through self-determined choice. Think about all you learned about the marketplace and economics. What's it all about? It's all about having a mechanism that allows people to make individual choices that satisfy their needs as they define them. And when we collectivize those needs, when we put them all together, it produces the greatest possible degree of satisfaction of human needs. So if that's true, then what's the role of self-determination in that worldview? The answer is it is an instrumental value. Self-determined is an instrumental value. It's a means to an end. The end, the ultimate goal, is satisfaction of needs. Self-determination is one way to get there, a most effective way to get there, because we really can't tell what someone thinks their needs are. But if we think we know what satisfaction means, if we can project what we think an individual will value and will be satisfied by, such as resolution is one possibility, justice is another possibility, relationship or reconciliation is another possibility. If we think we can project that those things will satisfy the individual, and second point, psychological and social barriers like the cognitive biases, the unconscious biases that work on us as individuals, as human beings, actually obstruct individuals from making clear, rational choices. In other words, we think we know what will satisfy people, and they can't actually choose to attain that goal because some kind of psychological limitations make it impossible for them, obstruct their individual choice process. Then you know what? Self-determination, our instrumental tool, doesn't work, quote unquote. And therefore, it can be overridden. It's an instrument. It's not an end in itself. If it's an instrument and the instrument doesn't work, we have to look for a different instrument. And if that's true, then it's entirely possible that outside directiveness is justifiable because self-determination won't do the job, won't produce the satisfaction that is the highest value. This is the place of self-determination in an individualist philosophy, of which there are many examples. It is an instrument for achieving the ultimate goal, which is satisfaction of the individual's needs. Where it won't work, we have to find some other instrument. Other instruments are available. Instruments like, in the context of mediation, the tools, the directive devices that mediators can use to push people towards an agreement, or push people towards reconciliation, or push people towards a fairer outcome, justice. We can do that. And in fact, we have a lot of power to do that. I don't know if it lasts or it doesn't last, but the third party role in itself carries a lot of power to affect people's choices. So when we say you control the outcome, but I control the process, the one who controls the process controls the outcome. That's what all the research on communication tells us. If you control the process, you influence the outcome and you ultimately control the outcome. So but you may need to do that. And if you need to do it because self-determination doesn't work, as they say in Australia, where one of my children lives, good on you, good on you, you're doing the right thing. The relational worldview has a totally different view of the value of self-determination. Self-determination in the relational worldview is not an instrument. Self-determination is itself an essential value, something that can't be overridden, because there's nothing more valuable than that itself. Let's parse that out. The highest value in the relational worldview is moral conduct. Now, I have to define that now, which is a hard thing to do, but it's not so hard, at least not the way that I've defined it. Moral conduct is, I want to suggest, conduct that integrates and balances regard for self and regard for other. My most inspirational source for this is the work of a woman named Carol Gilligan, who's a moral developmental psychologist and philosopher, who talks about, quote unquote, the moral realm of human life. What's the moral realm? It's not, the Ten Commandments, though I certainly have a lot of respect for the Ten Commandments. The moral realm is the realm where human beings interact one with another. It's the I-thou realm, to allude to Martin Buber, for example. And in that realm, we are always facing choices. How much regard do I give to myself? How much regard do I give to the other person in this interaction? If I place regard on myself alone, that's what you would call self-centeredness, selfishness, egocentricity. But if I place regard on the other person alone, that is self-submergence. That may be considered saintly conduct in some ways. But the fact of the matter is, for most of us, non-saints, the highest moral reach that we have is where we can recognize equally and regard equally both ourselves and each other. Balanced regard for self and other. When we published the Promise of Mediation, we talked about that, and we called it, quote unquote, compassionate strength. Strength of self and compassion for the other. Dual regard balances these two dimensions, regard for self and regard for other. It doesn't presume anything about outcome. It doesn't presume anything about outcome. It's the way we think about a situation, not what we ultimately agree to do about it. Because the solution may be totally different in the balance that each of us strikes. And that's what we may talk about. How do we want to balance this, each of us, in the interaction that we have? Self-determination is not a tool to achieve this goal. It's an essential part of this balance. Self-determination manifests regard for self. It actualizes regard for self. I actually can think through what I want to do. I can understand, going back to Jeremy Leck, I can understand myself. I can understand what I value, and I can decide to act on that basis. I can overcome the confusion that I might have. I can act with strength of self, not out of confusion and unclarity and some vague, unclear notion of who I am and what I want. At the same time, self-determination makes regard for the other meaningful. Forced regard for the other party is not regard, it's not real regard for the other at all. If I'm not choosing how much attention and concern I want to give to the other party, if I'm not choosing to give that concern, it isn't real concern. It's phony. And people realize this. Okay, I'm not going to get into more detail than that at the moment. So what is the effect of outside directiveness by a third party? We can't say here that people can't do this for themselves because of some internal obstacles. No, if I am directing that from the outside, it displaces both of these elements. It attenuates the self-regard that I might otherwise have. You don't know what you're doing, let me do it for you. When we tell people in a mediation, don't use that language. Here are the ground rules. This is when we should meet separately. Every time, again, like I said earlier, we tell people, do this, do this, do this, don't do that, don't do that. It disempowers people. And by disempowering them, it keeps them from manifesting self-regard. And it also, if we are telling them how to think about and look at the other party, it takes away their choice about regard for other. So directiveness displaces both elements, regard for self and regard for other. It restricts the realm of the choice that people have about that balance between self and other regard. It essentially restricts the realm of moral choice. If moral choice is the thing that matters most, then directiveness is never justifiable. There's never a reason that can justify it because it automatically displaces the primary value that we hold. So the place of self-determination in a relational philosophy is not that it's a tool to something, it's an essential part of moral conduct per se. So that's very different. That's a very different view of the importance of self-determination. That goes back to my title. Why do we have this self-determination principle? Because the very essence and goal of what we're looking for here, the goal of having an institution that supports and facilitates moral conduct on the part of parties in conflict. That's what we're here for. That's what we're here to do. Self-determination cannot be restricted if that's what we're here to do, because if we do it, it makes it impossible for them to choose the high road instead of the low road, to make that moral choice. So again, to conclude, I'm going to conclude now. I'm sure there's lots of questions about this part, and that's fine. Our attitude towards self-determination stems from and expresses our deepest values about what? About what matters most in life: satisfaction or moral conduct, what we get or how we behave towards ourselves and each other. What matters most? I know there might be a question like, why do you make this a black and white choice? Can't we have both? Can't we consider both things equally important? To which my answer is no, we can't. Then this may be just my extremism, but it's also logical. If you ask the question, what's the highest value? Highest means it's number one. And there's no tying number one and number two. There's prioritizing, right? Those who hold a relational worldview place the highest value on moral conduct. And if that's true, that's what makes self-determination important. And that's what makes self-determination essential. It's fundamental, and it's not just instrumental. And therefore, it can't be overridden, no matter what other values are at stake. It can't be overridden for the sake of resolution, for the sake of achieving justice among parties of unequal power, for the sake of achieving reconciliation, even in a family which ought to be continuing in a reconciled situation. It doesn't work to have two highest values. Ethical principles require you to say, what comes first? Ethics is always about a choice of what comes first, what takes precedence over the other thing. That's the whole idea of ethical principles. When we say self-determination is fundamental in the mediation process, we say it and we mean it. At least I think we mean it. We should mean it, even if other values are put at risk. That's the principle that, if we really believe it, it's rooted, and it can only be explained in terms of the relational worldview and the view that how we behave is even more important than what we get. Therefore, we differ about the role of self-determination, because we differ as to the values that we put in first place, the worldviews that we hold. That's okay. I don't know that I can come back at the end here now and answer the last question that I asked at the very beginning, if you remember what that was. What I asked was, why do we differ? Is there a right and wrong to this? The answer is, I think we clearly differ. And I think I know why we differ, because of these different values and worldviews. But I am not willing to say, some of my colleagues might be, but I'm not willing to say there's a right and a wrong here, that you don't hold the right, quote unquote, worldview. You don't have the right values. I think it's good to know and be clear about what values and worldview we do hold and operate out of. But at least we have to agree on one thing, and that is that there are differences between us as to these values. I happen to think that the whole world we live in today is going to depend for its survival on whether we can learn to live with differences, because I don't think we can resolve all the differences that we have. The differences get greater and greater, multiply as society becomes more diverse. We have to learn how to live with difference, and we can learn to live with difference if we're clear about what it is and we make space for each other. I'm going to end on one last statement, which is what my father, God bless him, used to say. And he was a business person. He was not somebody who you would think would not care about the bottom line. He absolutely cared about the bottom line. But what he always said was that as a business person and as a human being, his principle was stand up for yourself and make room for the other guy. Dave Bush was his name. That's the epigram of one of my books. Stand up for yourself and make room for the other guy. In other words, the way I live is I have regard for myself and I have regard for the other guy. And I'm always struggling to balance those two. And I don't know where I'm going to come out. But what matters is that I'm always sitting on the knife edge. I'm always struggling to include both me and you, I and thou. That's what makes my life meaningful, not how many shoes I sold this year. That's what he did. And that's where I grew up, in a shoe store, learning that ethical principle. Okay, friends, I'm going to stop talking now and go back to the room.
Wonderful,
Again,
amazing.
I'm going
Thank you. There have
to.
been a whole ton of questions and exchange and agreement and disagreement in the chat. First, I want to thank you. I think we have about 10 or 13 minutes for some follow-up questions. I want to open the floor and ask everybody to be as brief as possible in your question, and I do want to give the opportunity to those who haven't spoken yet. I know, Ramona, you had a question that we didn't get to that I promised you could ask. I don't know if you're still on the line and still available to ask it, but I wanted to encourage you to ask first, if you can. We have about a little bit of time to benefit live from Professor Bush's wisdom still.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me?
We hear you.
All right, thank you. And thank you for your presentation. I think that one of the important essences of transformative mediation is the ability of the mediator to be fully present. In addition to asking questions and reflecting back, I think it makes a difference to the parties if they really sense that the mediator is fully present. And that is not easy to do because so many things intrude upon our minds. And I'm wondering, do you have any strategies that you used prior to mediation or during the mediation for keeping yourself fully present? Thank you.
First of all, I couldn't agree with you more. The sort of first, bullet that I put on that page of strong view of self-determination, listen without an agenda, is a kind of synonym for being totally present. And if I wanted to give one example of a way that we can learn to be totally present in mediation, so I would suggest that if you imagine yourself speaking to a dear friend who has just lost a family member, and they're speaking to you, how you would be with them. Your mind would not be on anything else. You wouldn't have an agenda. You wouldn't be trying to make them feel better. Or if you would, you'd be a poor friend. You would be listening. You would be there with them. That's the primary sort of element of consoling someone. That's what we do as mediators. We are there with people, and that's a good practical exercise. Imagine that's who that person is. They are your mother, father, sister, brother, child, talking to you about something that's been devastating in their life. What are you going to do? You're going to sit there thinking about, there are many things more I could say about that. One of the big progresses I made with my relationship with my father over the years was when my father realized that when I was talking to him, he didn't need to solve my problem. He just needed to be there with me. He totally changed. Our relationship totally changed. That's an example, Ramona. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
All right, Jeremy, I know you're brilliant, but I want to give a chance to somebody who hasn't had the floor. Nan, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I practice transformative mediation at the Dayton Mediation Center. Thanks so much for all the work that you've done. I saw a question in the chat that I think really needs to be raised to the forefront, which is a practical question. What happens in a mediation that has a lot of practical elements where you have information, you have legal information, you have process information about options that the parties don't have? How does transformative mediation handle that situation?
Okay, great question. There are a bunch of other people from Dayton around here, I think, including The former director, Tom Walrab, I should direct that question to him. Hi, Tom. One answer to that is, again, what I'm doing when I listen to people, I'm listening for a lot of stuff. I'm listening to the questions implicit in what they say. Okay, so if it goes to questions about resources, right? So if I don't hear any, if someone is saying, well, so I think we really ought to agree to do this, and the other party is also agreeing, and I know that there might be legal issues with that, right? I'm not, unless I hear some hesitancy about what the parties are saying, I am not going to do anything to add that information. If I hear sort of, well, I guess we could do such and such, but I'm not sure, then I would reflect to that person. So it sounds like you'd like to do such and such, but you're not 100% sure. It sounds like you have some concerns about doing that. And then they would say, well, yeah, I do. I have these concerns. And then I would reflect that. I would have a conversation with them about what their hesitancy is, why they have it, what they want to do about it. And if it came to the question of, well, so I don't know where to go to get that kind of support or resource. And I would say, so that's your question now. Where do you go to get that kind of help? So, there may be people right here in this office, right, who have resources. You could go to the front desk and talk to someone. You can get a pamphlet about it. But I'm not going to become the resource counselor, me personally. Why not? Why am I not going to do that? Because you can't ride two horses. You can't wear two hats at the same time. It's, the people used to ride two horses in the Wild West shows, but that was a very difficult thing to do, and you risk getting torn apart. If you're going to be a counselor, be a counselor. If you're going to be a mediator, what is a mediator? A supporter, a conversation supporter. And a supporter helps people to realize that they're actually thinking about resources they might need, but he doesn't tell them where to go to get those resources. The further you go down that road, the more likely you are to become an expert advisor to the parties, which is not your role. So again, I tend to be an extremist. I tend to make the role divisions very clear and sharp because, it's easy to slide back and forth. And I want to try not to do that. Why is that? Because if I do that, again, think about all the way back. If I do that, then I risk, if I start being an advisor to the parties, then I risk attenuating self-determination. If I attenuate self-determination, then I attenuate the realm of moral choice. I attenuate people, I take away people's ability to, like my father would say, stand up for themselves. The process of reflection, I know I'm harping on it, is the strongest tool I believe that there is to help people stand up for themselves without taking away their choices. And it's a very powerful tool. And those of you who are in doubt about that, consult with your fellow mediators who do transformative mediation and listen to what they say. Okay, try to keep it short.
Thank you.
Excellent. Well, I'd like to offer Natalie the next opportunity to pose a question, but I just wanted to see if you could cite or list or mention some of the other techniques other than reflection that you think are strong in moving the process as a transformative mediator.
In bulleted form, they were all on that page that I showed you. And you want to know more about them? I'm not selling my book. Okay. I don't get any money for it anyway anymore. I think they don't give me like 2 cents on the dollar. Buy Promise of Mediation. Read it. They're all in there. And there's a 2-chapter line by line case study transcript that situates the techniques in the context of a real case. So otherwise, I certainly could give you a lot of other practical pointers, but that's not, I don't think, the point of this session. I'm not trying to get out of it. I'm just trying to keep us on focus here. Natalie.
Excellent.
You didn't have to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning. You're in London. You're having dinner already.
Yeah, exactly. It'll be tea time here soon. Thank you very much, That was really interesting. My question is, to what extent do you think the benefits of transformative mediation are compromised when the parties hold an individualistic worldview, if any?
Well, I think that if the parties, that's a great question, actually. How do I know if the parties really want what I'm selling, right? So one thing is you have to be able to right up front tell people what it is that you're selling in language that they can understand, which I think someone talked about in the pre-discussion. Someone mentioned this before. I need to tell people, look, so what I'm here to do is to help you have a conversation that allows you to make choices for yourselves about the situation, including choices about what you want to talk about, what you want to say, what you don't want to say, how you want to talk about it, when you want to stop talking about it, when you want to leave, and how you want to understand each other. All of those are things that you can talk about. This is basically talk that we're doing here. And those are the things you can talk about. And I'm not going to make decisions for you about any of those things. All those things are up to you. If you think that that would help you to have that kind of a conversation, and clearly you've been having a pretty negative conversation up until now, or you wouldn't be here. If you think that that will help you to have a more positive conversation with each other, then I think I can help with that. If that doesn't sound appealing to you, but if you think you just basically need someone to give you advice about what to do, I'm not going to do that. I don't do that. I do this, I don't do that. Doctors prescribe medicine, homeopaths give remedies, they don't cross the line. And this is what I do. I don't do what others do. If you think it would help you to have someone give you a sharp, clear opinion about what exactly it is that you should do and what's not a good idea, other people will do that. And I can even send you to some of them. I know them. I'm willing to send you to them. That's what you have to do. People who opt for you after you say that kind of thing, it shows that they're holding a relational worldview, right? They care about how they're behaving to each other as much as what's going to happen as a result of this. People who say that sounds like a bunch of hooey to me obviously don't care about how they're behaving, and they're more concerned with what they walk away with at the end of the session. So I don't think we can ask people, are you an individualist or a relationalist? And those are just abstract terms to describe, actual human experiences. Is that helpful?
Yes, very. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Jeremy has been very patient, and I think we can end with him as we hit the 10 a.m. New York hour. But I just wanted to just mention that there has been a strain in the chat about what to do when somebody, one or both or many of the parties, are bullying and really using the process of mediation to do hurtful things to the other parties. And I think similar imbalances. I think in a more specific way that addresses the question you just spoke to, when somebody's not really buying into the process. But there have been some other great transformative mediators that have been answering in line. I don't want to give the impression that we're ignoring that question, but I do want to give the floor over to Jeremy, who has been waiting so patiently. And again, we've been listing a bunch of resources for follow-up. And I think you've set up a lot of things that can address those kinds of issues. So Jeremy, let me give you the floor for the final.
Before you give Jeremy the last word, I'm gonna jump in the middle. And give you another resource. Okay, so another thing that you can put in the chat, if you can find it quickly, is an article that I wrote with my partner Joe Folger years ago called Mediation and Social Justice, that addresses pretty much in depth the concern about unequal power, bullying. All of those things are on a spectrum related to power imbalance and what we believe about that and how to address it. So without going into long details about how you do that, without taking over the discussion as a mediator, just supporting party conversation, that is directly addressed in that article. and I encourage you to find it. Mediation and Social Justice. It was published, I think, in the Ohio Journal on Dispute Resolution quite a few years ago. And I hope that you can, okay, look, somebody is, oh yeah, but the truth is all of the stuff that I've ever written, except for the books, is posted on the Hofstra Law School Faculty Scholarship page, on the Hofstra Law School webpage, and it all can be downloaded for free. So if you're interested in that, go for it. Jeremy, over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, I really am grateful for this way of looking at the moral aspect, because I do think it's a fundamental ethic question. And let me put it this way. I struggle with our responsibility as mediators, whether you're transformative or another style, with regard to this balance between standing up for yourself, allowing the parties to do so, and having consideration for the other. And it's not just this, in a way, cultural view of how individualistic are you and how collectivist are you. I'm trying to touch on something else, which is, in some mediations, it's just about substantive topics people need to talk about. In others, it might just be financial. They need to reach a compromise. But when it's relational, when people really need to connect and be able to talk, this is where we as mediators have influence in terms of social plasticity. Let's take a situation where people feel out of tribe. They have reduced compassion, they have no empathy, they're just thinking about the substantive issues, or situations where you've created social plasticity in the sense of they feel in group, they feel in tribe, and then you have an unconscious greater empathy, an unconscious greater compassion for the other, which you're going to start to resonate more with the other. Now, these are unconscious choices. If a person hears another person suffering and they fully start spiraling negatively because they're so in phase with them, or they feel very distant because they feel out of phase with them, these are unconscious choices. So to what extent do we as mediators kind of need to think, well, this is a relational mediation. I need to help them to connect at a level where they can be in empathy and compassion with one another? Or to what extent is it that we don't need to preoccupy ourselves with these sorts of issues?
Okay, so let me give you at least a quick response to that. I don't believe that people in a financial or a business dispute are not in a relational context. Not at all. I don't think there is a conflict. And when people have a money dispute, oh, there's always heavy-duty relational stuff going on there. So I don't think those categories make any sense in terms of real human life.
They're always there.
They're
all three of them are always there, right?
The substantive stuff and the relational stuff is always there all the time. There's not a case where I think that the question of what am I going to get and the question of how am I going to behave are not both on the table. And I still, in any of those contexts, like my father running his business, have to make a choice about what is it that I'm going to pay more attention to, what I get or how I behave. Now, and people make different choices about that. That's fine. I don't think that what I do has to change at all to support people. In other words, and people sometimes say, well, transformative mediation doesn't work except in certain kinds of cases. No, that's if people have a total money dispute, can you help them and they don't care about their relationship? Of course I can. I can help them make clear choices. They have choices to make. I can help them do that. They also have choices about how much attention they want to give to what the other party is asking for. I can help them make that choice too, by the same methods that I use in any case. As far as this second question, which comes back to your original question, Jeremy, about unconscious forces that work on all of us all the time, whatever kind of biases they are, whether they're cultural or psychological or cognitive. Again, I don't think there is anything I can do as a mediator that can usefully affect those biases in a direct way. I think the most that I can do, and this goes a little bit to that article on mediation and social justice, the most I can do, again, is to help people hear themselves and make choices about what they hear. Whether they, oh, I just said that? I can't believe that I just said that. Why would I say something like that? It's the kind of person I am. I just made an assumption about this other person. I don't want to make that kind of assumption. I can help them do that by helping them listen to themselves. If I believe that they have, quote unquote, the right stuff. The one thing I didn't talk about today, but as part of our transformative theoretical framework, is people have not only the desire to be, to act with agency and empathy, they have the capacity to do it. They have the capacity to do it. And they have that capacity within themselves, including the capacity to know what they don't know. One of my best teachers ever, when students would ask a question, would always respond first by saying, "Do you know what you don't know?" Oh my gosh, what does that mean? It means that do you realize why you're asking this question? And that's something frequently people don't know what they don't know. That's what you're concerned about. But the only thing I can do about it as a mediator, without becoming an expert, without becoming a resource person, is, and again, I've explained why I don't want to do that. The only thing I can do is to hear them and then to lift up what they are saying. And
but if you can influence the choice to be in a situation of an emotional state of empathy or compassion or not, this is my real dilemma. It's that level which everything you're saying I get. But if you as a mediator can influence, and I believe we do influence people's ability to feel in group or out of group, if they feel they're sitting opposite sides of the table. So we drive compassion. Is that one of our responsibilities?
I'll give you a short answer. No, it's not. Why? Because whether to be empathetic or not is a choice. It's one of the choices that people have to make in any kind of interaction. How much, do I want to feel for this other person? I might be able to do things to drive people towards greater empathy, right? To get people to be more empathetic. But I don't want to do it. Why? Because it violates the principle of self-determination. Getting people to be empathetic is overriding party self-determination. So that's the sort of answer. Okay, you've all been very patient and wonderful, and I can't believe that you've all hung in there all this time, but thank you very much for your patience and your attention, and I hope I can help you in the future in some way or another through the stuff I've written or through the institute that I founded and still runs and offers trainings, both virtual and real live personal. And that institute can be found on the web at Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation. You'll look that up for us also, I think, right? And post it in the chat. Several of the people here. Yeah, there you go. That's it. That's it. It's Institute for the Study of Conflict Transformation.org. It's an org, not a com. Thank you so much. Maria, thank you so much for your invitation. I hope I haven't abused people's time and patience and empathy.
So on behalf of all of us, thank you so very much. This has been inspirational, informative. We're at a different stage in the field where we can have these kinds of conversations versus
Absolutely.
way back when you were trying to construct, a way of thinking about how we can proceed with our work. So I can't thank you enough for being with us. And as you can see, we still have a full house and probably could stay all day, but we always say at 10 o'clock, we turn off the recording, and we're beyond that point. So we are going to turn off the recording and see everyone again next month with Damali Peterman. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
You're welcome. Do you want me to hang around for a little while, Maria, or we're